This is Duke University.
First and foremost, we'll give our newly defended dissertation moderator, Jackie Vahey, a big round of applause. A current student in our CB program. So we're excited to have Jackie joining us as a moderator, and we're excited for the session with who she will be interviewing. Dr. Jeff Head, and Jackie's also Dr. Jackie Vahey. So Jeff Head is a graduate of Duke University in '09 and is currently the Vice President of Commercial Data Science at the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson. We'll take about 35 minutes, 40 minutes of back and forth, but then we'll also provide time for you to ask some questions, whether it be in the chat or if you want to use the hand raise feature. But without further ado, take it away, Jackie and Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Rudy. So I think we're gonna start by just doing a quick poll so that we kind of all know where everyone's coming from. So if we could put the poll up, that would be great. Computational biology was, has really developed over, the past 20 or so years. So just looking to give Jeff an idea of where everyone's coming from.
That sounds good. Great question. All right.
Great. So it looks like we have about half who responded from the wet lab biology side, and then some dry lab computational and computer science, and a couple others. So it's a pretty widespread.
Yeah, great mix, and that makes good sense for an interdisciplinary program like this.
Yeah, so do you think you could start off by telling us about yourself and, how you got from, joining the CBB program in the first cohort, what drew you to that, and then all the way through like your current, what drew you to your current position?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Jackie, and thanks. It's an awesome honor to meet with you all this evening. So, thanks for that opportunity. I'm calling from New Jersey, where I work day to day for Janssen. So it's a great question. How did I get here? So my undergrad, I went to Brown University, and I when I was there, was really into both. I loved the computer science classes I was taking. I love the chemistry and biology curriculum I was taking, as well. And Brown had some interdisciplinary majors, like that. And so I was able to select for my concentration computational biology, which at the time was one of the few undergrad programs, in that discipline. And so, I think from there, I was really intrigued by what, one could do by applying quantitative methods to, biological or other life science type problems. And so, I started looking at graduate programs and thought, how can I continue this? And there were very few, in the country at that time. So, I was looking at grad schools in late 2002. And Duke was one, and there were a few others. And even when I applied and interviewed, going from school to school, I saw the same applicants because we were all kind of looking at the handful of programs that were out there. I was really intrigued by Duke. I love the faculty that I met with. I love their passion. I loved what they were thought possible. I think being such a major medical center was an appeal as well. That that there would be a lot of great opportunity to do good science. And I liked that it was brand new. I think that being able to be part of something, from the ground floor is a unique opportunity. And so, I ended up choosing Duke, and was really glad that I did. As you said, Jackie, I was part of the first cohort. At the time, the program was called BGT, Bioinformatics and Genome Technology. And after a few years, we all, the students and faculty thought, well, maybe this doesn't quite capture everything that we're doing. Computational biology was becoming, more of a standard term in the field. And so we made that, the decision to change the name of the program to what it is now. It was a great experience. So I was at Duke for about 6.5 years. I ended up, working. I graduated out of Dave and Jane Richardson's lab in biochemistry, and I worked on. I did some molecular dynamics in my early years. I looked at protein-protein interfaces, protein, RNA, DNA complexes, how you can apply methods in topology to study their interfaces. Then I got really into crystallography and how you could apply algorithms to build better models against really low resolution data. And that's how I started getting into, things that became called machine learning. We didn't call it that at the time. We were doing clustering and other, type, unsupervised methods to build better protein structures. But it ended up being a very fortuitous skill set to develop as time moved on. And so, in the latter time at Duke, I got involved in a program called Phoenix, where it was whoa, my camera thinks there's somebody else in the room. So we may do that a couple times, but it was an interdisciplinary collaboration between the academic world and the pharmaceutical industry. And so I worked with, it was Duke, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, Los Alamos National Lab, and Cambridge in the UK were the academic partners. And then there were 10 to 12 pharmaceutical companies that used the software that we built in their discovery pipelines. So that was my first taste of working with industry. I graduated, I did a postdoc at Lawrence Berkeley Lab with Paul Adams, and he was the head PI on that overall collaboration. And there I got, really delved into more algorithmic problem solving and development, and built some methods for building higher quality structures with low resolution data was, the area that I was really focused in, but also started to build more connections within the pharmaceutical industry. And so I spent 3 years at Berkeley. I came back to Duke for another year with Dave and Jane, and worked on, tying up some research we had going, and get that in a good place. But knew, Dave and Jane knew I was thinking about what was next, and were really supportive of me exploring what would come next in my career. And so it was this was in 2013. Data science was becoming a really popular buzzword and job title, and the experience I had fit really well with the types of skills and experience they were looking for. There were no data science programs at that point, so we were all coming from different disciplines. And so I interviewed with a few companies, and ultimately I really liked the vision that they had at Janssen, which is part of Johnson & Johnson. And there again, I was part of the very first data science team. It was founded in 2013. I joined in early 2014. I was the fourth data scientist in the company, and now there are hundreds across all of J&J. So it was great to have that, again, get it on the ground level. We started in pharma R&D, but we quickly expanded to supply chain, commercial. We looked across sectors. So J&J has 3 sectors, how our business is organized. So you have pharmaceuticals under Janssen, then we have medical devices, which has things like Ethicon and diffuse synthase. So we make surgical equipment, knee, hip replacement, trauma parts. There's a surgical robotics division now. Vision care, AccuView is a J&J company if you wear contact lenses. And then there's the consumer products that you may be aware of: Johnson Baby, Band-Aid, and Listerine, Neutrogena, all those sorts of things. So there were a lot of, we were the only game in town for algorithmic data science. And so our team, while we sat in pharma, we did work across all of those sectors and functions. And I really got, was intrigued by what we could do on the commercial side, where it really is a very data-rich environment, and it's in that last mile execution of bringing a product to a patient in need and seeing a successful outcome. And I really loved, how you could tie the work we were doing to those patient stories and see, what impact we had. And so I gravitated more towards those, those use cases or problems that were directly applicable in the last mile of the market. And so I spent 4 years in pharma, worked my way up as a data scientist. I moved to medical devices for 2 years, and we set up a team there for the first time. And there I learned it's such a different business. Pharma we have like 12 products on the market or so at a given time. In medical devices, there's 900,000 SKUs or product codes. And so it's just a very different, it's run very different. The end customer is a little bit different as well, depending on the market. So I learned so much about the US healthcare system, which has been foundational for me as I've, now continued to grow my career. And so in 2019, I came back to pharma. There was a chance to take on a bit more of a leadership role. And over the last 2 years, as of last year, I was able to land this VP role and lead the organization. And so I have a team of 40 data scientists and from mostly PhDs from all kinds of backgrounds. And so, I think tying it to the poll, I'd say I probably have about 50-50 of folks that maybe came from computer science or math, and others that came maybe from wet labs but did some computational work in their course of study. Our team culture has always been agnostic who we recruit, what their degree or background may be in, and I've continued that because I think it's been very successful for us. But we work on, we apply machine learning, deep learning, and related methods to problems across the pharmaceutical commercial value chain, which is everything following regulatory approval. And so there's things like scientific and medical engagement, there's payer and larger healthcare institution related problems, direct patient journey and patient experience, adherence and things like that. And then also engaging from a commercial perspective with our primary customer base, which it would be healthcare providers who are able to write prescriptions. So it's really wide ranging, really interesting data landscape, as well as methodology that we're allowed to apply that to. And so it's been, I've been here now for 8 years, and it's been an amazing journey and a great company to work for.
Thank you so much. That's such a journey. It's, every step you're like, well, I was on this first team and we had to grow it, but then it got started and I moved to some new team where it could be new again.
It does feel that way. It's like being a serial entrepreneur of team building, maybe.
So, do you feel, you said that, as the team is, hiring new people, you're seeing, applicants from all different backgrounds. Do you see hiring managers viewing applicants differently, or is there anything that, really makes someone stand out as, really ready to contribute and learn?
It's a great question. I think it's I would say two things. One, a really deep hands-on experience solving some kind of a problem. It could be any kind of a problem, but it's something you would have done in your course of certainly getting a PhD or even a master's degree. where you've spent, a year or two really having to refine a problem statement, come up with an experimental method, prove out an outcome and communicate your results. I think that's really important. Like that's the first foundational thing that we look for. And then how do you tell that story? How do you describe the problem, the solution, or the possible solutions that you explored, ultimately what you landed on and why, and what the outcome was? And if you can tell that story, in a believable and concise, way, then perhaps you can then do that and sell a marketer on why, our latest patient model is going to, be impactful in market. So I think that communication and being able to control the narrative of your science is so really important.
Yeah, that communication aspect's really an extra step. Yeah. So when you were making your choice to kind of move more towards a leadership position, were you thinking that would be your path the whole time, or were you did you change your mind based on something that happened?
Yeah, I've kept my options open as I've gone through my career. I mean, even when in my postdoctoral years, I was working on grants and thinking about potentially an academic career and keeping that door open as well. I think here I would say in my academic career, both at Duke and when I was at Berkeley, I really valued teaching and mentorship. And one of the opportunities I had was to teach at a crystallography course at Cold Spring Harbor lab, and I did that for probably 5 or 6 years across while I was at Duke or Berkeley, and I've loved that experience, being able to to teach and problem solve together with a more advanced student population, and so I carried that into my corporate career as well. I really enjoyed mentorship. I got into managing interns early on. Then they gave me more responsibility with direct reports, and then team building, and you kind of work your way up at a company like this through increasing management responsibility. And for me, it really is that mentorship piece. I love problem solving. I love seeing other perspectives come in, and I learn so much from my team members as well. So I think that has informed a lot of how I've gone about my career progression, and I think scope of impact is also really appealing. It was very hard for me to get out of the hands-on. When I got to a point where I couldn't write the code anymore, because there's too many things in the portfolio. There's too many people. That was a really hard transition for me. But what clicked for me was, I have the trust in my people. The impact is going to be much broader if I look at the breadth of the portfolio, and I can focus my time on, are we working on the right problems? Making sure that we're doing the right things together, and that's been really rewarding.
Yeah, it's I'm starting to look at positions, and I'm sure that other people here are too, and it's really challenging when the interviewer asks, like, what do you think your career path looks like? Because most PhDs have pretty much only done research, and so it's really interesting to hear how you chose that path and how it kind of developed for you. So you had mentioned kind of that you had started managing interns. Were you managing like undergraduate interns, or what's your view on kind of graduate level internships, I guess, as well?
Yeah, it's so it's going to vary by company, but for us at J&J, we've had interns that span undergrads, folks in master's programs, and we have had a few PhD interns as well for the right program where that makes sense for their academic course of study. Most are either undergrad or master's in kind of the summer between two academic years, tends to be when we have most of them. But it's been, a mix of all disciplines and schools and points in one's academic study.
Yeah, I've been hearing a lot more about internships for PhDs lately, and I wasn't sure how much that was because I'm talking to people interested in industry who aren't quite ready to graduate, or if it's, if you're seeing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to see more of it, to be honest. I think, it's a great way to give potential, future scientists in your organization a chance to experience what it's really like to work in a company culture, what the projects are like, and what the day-to-day experience is. And then when you do have open roles, it builds a natural talent pipeline, at what I think is like the sweet spot for coming in and being really, really productive as an entry-level scientist. So I've seen some great success stories, and I think as the labor market becomes more challenging, there's so many opportunities now in this kind of quantitative science across fields. I think any ways that we can create more avenues for to build talent pipelines will, I think, be really important.
Very cool. Yeah, it's always easier when you know someone.
Yeah. Getting your foot in the door is often the hardest thing. So, it's good to, I love that there are these kinds of, connections. So now you all have, if you see something that you're interested in at J&J, consider me a friend, and, I'm happy to make connections for you. But, leveraging the Duke network is really important. And that's actually how I landed the interview at Janssen. I had a CBB classmate who graduated ahead of me, and she worked at Novartis, and through some networking, I ended up connected with the group leader here. So networking is so important.
Yeah, always so challenging.
It is, but we I don't know anyone, certainly from CBB or other Duke grads I know, who don't want to help. And I would say my peers here are equally passionate about their schools. So I think it's reach out. Even if you see somebody on LinkedIn that went to Duke and is that a company you're interested in, they'll probably talk to you. I'm always happy if I get a cold email on LinkedIn. I'll talk to the person and see how I can help.
That's really great to hear. So we also had a question about like what your typical workday looks like.
Yeah.
Like what types of challenges you see day to day, what your favorite challenges are, I guess.
Yeah.
And just what your typical day looks like.
Yeah, I mean, so my days in my role now, where I'm on the senior leadership team for the Janssen technology organization. It's a bit more strategic, looking at the whole portfolio, thinking a little bit more mid and long term. Are we investing in the right areas? How are we? Do we have people deployed in the right things? Talent development and mentorship. Are folks tracking towards what they want from their career growth? How are their projects going? So I meet a lot. I meet regularly with team members every day. I have a handful of one-on-ones with folks across the team just to check in specifically on their project work. I meet with my peers in other parts of the company to make sure we're on track with our major initiatives for the year, and even thinking about I know it's only it's just about April, but we're already talking about next year and what the focus is going to be for 2023. So in this role, it is a little bit more strategic that way. So it's a lot of dialogue. Now that we're back in the office, a lot of whiteboarding, and thinking through a myriad of potential challenges and opportunities. When I was more hands-on as a data scientist, it was a mix of meetings with your key collaborators and business partners in other parts of the organization, to maybe frame out the problem that you're working on, or take a deep dive into the data sets you're working with and leverage their subject matter expertise. Then you spend some hours building models or writing some code and looking at some analysis. And I think in the most fun projects, that's sort of a rapid cycle. A couple times a week, you're reviewing some results and get some great input, go back, iterate a little bit further, and eventually you get to something that either is going to actually drive like a recommendation engine in a commercial organization, or if you're working with one of our scientific or medical business teams, maybe you're going to write an abstract to present at a conference, or sometimes even a publication. So it's a wide range of where things go, but very collaborative. I think is very much an in-person. Before I was here 5 days a week before the pandemic. We're now 3 days on, 2 days virtual. But I really value those days in the office where we can, even before this meeting, I had to erase all the proprietary things that we had on this board from this morning. So it's, so it's a lot of, that kind of collaboration. But we have now learned how to work remotely. And so, we can use Zoom and other technologies to allow us to work that way.
Great. Yeah, so that seems similar but different than a normal day in academia. You're still, it sounds like you're doing a lot of thinking.
Yeah, I think it is, it's a lot of rapid, ideation and test something and then, come back. The timelines are really tight and rapid. And so, we're a publicly traded company, so we sort of live quarter to quarter. And so when you work on the commercial space, those are your timelines. So, we're at this point, we're through quarter close for quarter one, but now we're quickly, what do we have to get done in quarter two? What are the pressing challenges? What's changed? Prioritization shifts between therapeutic areas or brands, depending on market events or other considerations. So there's a lot of like rapid decision making that has to happen, and then you have to tactically move really quickly.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything that's very different than what you expected or what other people think when you tell them what your role is?
Yeah, I think, the depth of science across all aspects of the pharmaceutical business, I think, is really more than I would have expected. Certainly, that's going to be there in R&D, but if you look at how our supply chain is optimized, or how we develop messaging based on clinical results for the commercial teams, it's very analytical and really great, pushing the envelope in terms of application of science. So I think that's one that I wasn't necessarily expecting. And then just the sheer complexity of the healthcare system. I think we experience it certainly as patients as we go through our lives, but to sort of see the end-to-end of all the moving pieces in particularly the U.S. market, that was really eye-opening to me, and just how many opportunities there are to make a difference, for a patient with a really debilitating disease, to drive some really, really impressive outcomes for them. So I think that part was also eye-opening to me when I started working here.
Yeah, it's not always really clear exactly, when you're thinking about pharmaceuticals, that every medication does help people, and that, you know, a lot of people I've talked to in the industry have said similar things where they really do care about those things.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. I think our industry is, sometimes is fairly criticized, and we have had there are missteps, and there things that we can do better. But I think that certainly our company and peers that I know in other companies really do care about making a difference in people's lives, and we make decisions on what's in the in the pipeline, and ultimately, hopefully, eventually brought to market for the most at need populations. And so if you look at our oncology portfolio or our immunology portfolio or infectious disease, we're really going after diseases that have no cure, or have a segment of the patient population where current options really don't help, and their needs are not met. So that those are the sorts of and we're using now data science to unpack that, both find those patients, but also see what possible solutions haven't been explored for them.
That's really great. So if the people are on this call and they're like, wow, this sounds really awesome, but I don't feel really qualified for this yet, what do you think would be like a single action they could take right now that they could start moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think really think about the work you've done, the research you've done, and really ask yourself, why did this matter? Why was this important? And it probably really is, right? Every one of you, I'm sure your projects have been, critically important for some aspect of science. Really understand that story, and if you get into that mindset of being able to share that narrative to a broad audience, and be really excited about it, and really champion your impact, that's going to translate in any business, whether it's pharmaceuticals or finance or big tech, or any of those kinds of industries. So I think you probably have it in you. It's more just really being able to speak to your potential, and that's what we would be looking for an entry-level scientist.
So I'm hearing be confident and think impact.
Yes. And don't overdo it on the slides. If you're making a PowerPoint, clean and it's simple. Like we often, like, decks here get emailed around, and so what we strive for is if somebody who's never seen this presented, they should be able to read it and understand what you were trying to convey, and it tells some kind of a narrative. So that was a big learning for me, certainly coming in here. I loved all the animations, and here's just this big picture I'm going to talk to, and I had to learn how to better contextualize. But I think there's a lot of great resources. There's ton of YouTube videos that talk to you about, like, how to make effective presentations for technical content or scientific content. I would definitely recommend just searching around for some of those, because it can be you're probably only 5% away from a really impactful story.
Yeah, it's always interesting, when you hear someone talk about their own work and then you hear someone else try to repeat it back. It's like, I'm not sure that was what they said, but okay.
Yeah. I mean, and that's good practice too, right? Like, I think, asking your peers to repeat it back. If they're not able to succinctly, then you can think about how can you refine your narrative and storytelling to really make it that crisp and clear.
So we have a couple more minutes before I think we're going to open it up to questions. So okay. I have this list of quick fire questions.
Okay.
That I was just going to read off if you're ready.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay. yes or no, have you ever questioned your career path?
Yes.
Yes. On a 1 to 5 scale, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree, your role offers a work-life balance.
Ooh, so current role, probably a 2, but I knew what I was signing up for becoming an executive. I think as a hands-on data scientist, I'd say 4.
Okay. And what would you say your PhD life at Duke was?
I'd say it was a 4, and maybe that's why it took me 6.5 years to graduate, but I went to a lot of basketball games.
We all watched them,
I know. I think I camped out 6 times.
Nice.
And I would do it again in a heartbeat.
So what would you say your favorite place on campus is?
Cameron is the go-to, but I'd say if I needed time to think, I would walk around outside. There's so many beautiful outdoor spaces. I love the gardens. Even when I go back to Durham, I always visit there. So I think I'll go with the gardens.
It is very pretty. All right. One word, fill in the blank. Blank is a skill you use almost every day. Or every day. The almost is in parentheses.
Critical thinking.
Critical thinking. That's a good one. Yes or no, do you need a particular major to work in bioinformatics or data science?
No. I think, yeah, I mean, more than a one-word answer, but I think what your degree is in is less important than what you've done, and how those skills can be broadly applicable. So, if you want to be the head of bioinformatics, then, deep bioinformatics experience is probably really, important. But if you want a broader, there's so many different things you can do quantitatively.
And how you present your work.
Yes, exactly. It's all in the narrative.
At this time, I want to go ahead and interject just real quick and open it up for questions. Jackie, thank you so much for moderating. And if you have continued questions, go ahead. I know you've had the floor for a little bit, but if you have anything else, feel free to add that to that. Or if anybody wants to put something in the chat, we'll be looking at the chat and passing along those questions as well. But I think the best way to do this would be to use the hand raise feature down at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions, go ahead and ask.
I have a question. I don't know if I can just share.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I'm a current undergrad at Duke, and I'm not really sure what I should be or what to consider for postgrad, potential secondary degrees. What made you decide to go for a PhD as opposed to any other sort of?
Yeah, it's a great question. I did a summer research experience when I was an undergrad at Brown. So the summer between my junior and senior year, I spent the summer there and worked in a wet lab and did experiments, and I just loved that environment. And so I felt like I wanted to be in a lab for extended period of time. I was working with grad students and postdocs, so that was sort of the template that I had most access to, and it really excited me. So that was most what drew me to the PhD route, to be able to spend some years in a lab and really have my own project and write some papers and be part of that culture. And I definitely met what I was looking for. So I would say it was just based on my experience and what appealed to me.
There's a question in the chat. There's 2 questions in the chat, but I'm going to skip over one real quick because I think this one kind of ties into that. So as someone who's interested in transitioning into bioinfo, what kind of project would be the most helpful for the portfolio to demonstrate, to cultivate relevant skills?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's some application of, quantitative science to a life science problem, which I guess is a fairly vague, answer, but I think it can be pretty wide ranging. There's so much data in the world now, and it comes in so many different forms, whether it be, tabular or images or video or text or some combination of all of those things. So, some application of, then taking a large data set, analyzing it using some kind of algorithmic method to derive a new insight about science or life or health or something like that. I think would definitely be enough to get showcase your potential within a broader like data science like I'm in, or a broader quantitative science field. Bioinformatics specifically, I think would we'd want to show that, but really applied to whether it's looking at genomics or genetics, RNA-seq type data, biochemistry and maybe the kind of stuff that I did in 3D structure. So it's really thinking about what's in that problem space, and even that evolves, right? I think computational biology, bioinformatics, these are broad terms, so it may mean different things at different institutions, different companies. So sometimes it's even just what role you're most interested in, and whether you want a very specific type of you want to do a very specific type of research or work on a very specific type of problem, or you want to go into more of a generalist type field like where I've landed. So hopefully that gives you some idea, and I think maybe think about what you want to do, and then I think really understanding what that type of research is about.
And they say, thanks, that was very helpful. Also in the chat, I think this is also a great question of, to what degree do entry-level scientists continue to learn their position in your group? And I think that can go for anybody who's just exploring right now, or really anybody that might be about to transition into a position and they're trying to figure out if they have what it takes.
Yeah. I mean, I think continued education is such an important part of our culture. So you learn on the job, you learn enroll in the problems that you work on. We always try to challenge people to do things they've never done before, or explore either new methods or new data domains. So I think there's a lot of on the job learning. We encourage people to try innovative and new things. So we go to conferences, we read papers, we have journal clubs. It's almost like a big postdoc group to some degree at times. So we challenge each other that way. We learn from each other, and then even when it makes sense, we can do short educational experiences, or even for more junior entry-level employees who might come in straight out of undergrad. We've put folks through master's degrees, and they can do that at night. And a few of my my team members have really flourished through that path as well. So we're always learning. I'm always learning, and as well that this quarter I tried to learn a lot more about cloud computing. That's a bit more with my role as as part of the technology leadership team. But I think folks on within our team apply that in a data science context.
Excellent. Any other questions?
I might ask one that's kind of related to
sure.
something you said earlier about, I think you said something about maybe conferences. And that's something I've always wondered is, I have this idea of science and kind of the exchange of information being pretty broad and constant in academia, right? That's the one thing, this is harsh, but that's the one thing I really like, I would say. But I'm, looking like many to go into industry. I wonder to what degree, maybe not you so much, you're probably pretty busy, but the data scientists working with you, to what degree is there a lot of like conference participation? You guys are probably doing a lot of stuff that's not necessarily shareable, but to what degree do you participate in maybe like the broader scientific community, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's it's a mix, I would say. So there are industry specific conferences, and we are very active participants in those. And everyone on my team, I encourage to go to at least one conference per year. If they can get an abstract accepted, then they can go to more. Industry conferences, that was very jarring for me. It's very different than academic conferences. To your point around the proprietary information, what you can talk about, the presentations tend to not be very deep. On the R&D side a bit more, because there'll be talks around clinical results, and those are published. And so if you go to like ASCO, which is the big oncology conference in Chicago, it's like an academic conference, and that would be pretty indistinguishable for you. I think more on the commercial side, it's very secretive, and there's not as much depth there, but the exchange with your peers, I think, is just as deep and valuable. And so I've had really, that's what I get most out of going to those types of events is peer exchange and those sorts of things. We also go to a lot of, or pre-pandemic, we went to a lot of recruiting fairs, which is maybe a little bit of a different riff on the conference idea, but that had historically been a really good talent pipeline for us. And even like next week, there's a conference called ODSC, the Open Data Science Conference. And that's a mix of academic, industry, and career fair kind of all in one. And it's back to in person. So I'm sending a contingent from our org to go there. And that, those kinds of events can be really valuable as well. So it's different, but I think also, it's something that I've really valued as part of my corporate career. Oh, but legal review. I guess I should tell you from the presenter point of view, that's a fun difference. So your slides have to go through legal review, and that's I think we have reviews at Duke certainly, but it's a different level of what they're looking for. Like the first external presentation I gave, I tried to make it super vague, and the lawyer was like, remove all reference to oncology. And it was like, all I had in there was that we had a oncology pipeline. Like that was it. I was like, you can Google that. Like that is on the Janssen website. There's not a surprise that we're in that space, but they're like, no, like just use examples of things we don't do. And it's like, okay. So there is a little bit more of, I think, one, from protecting company secrets, but two, they don't want to open it up for you to put you in a tough spot from a question. There's a lot of training. There's there's sort of external presentation training that you go through, to make sure that you understand how to handle tough questions. Like if I were to go present, say 6 months ago, even I did virtual, these sorts of forums. I would get questions about the Janssen vaccine, and I can't talk about the Janssen vaccine. And I know that, at my point in my career, but as a more junior scientist, that would have been a tough one. What do I say? What do I don't say? And so it's better to not even put yourself in that position.
We've got time for about one or two more questions. So if anybody wants to go ahead, now is your chance.
I had one more question if everyone else is good.
Sure, sounds good.
I was wondering, you've been working in the industry, we've been over this kind of the whole time, right?
Yeah.
Like it was just starting when you joined, and it's really picking up speed now. Are you seeing a shift in industry hiring, especially in terms of kind of experience necessary to break into these kind of entry level roles? In terms of, what degree people have, if they have a postdoc, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I think the shift has been to more consideration of hires even straight out of PhD. So like right where you are, Jackie, you certainly could interview for for roles here without postdoc experience. I think earlier in my career, we looked for a few years of postdoc experience, and I think I think it's part of it is the increased need for talent like us that have this kind of skill. There's so many more opportunities, and the talent pool hasn't gotten as kept up with that pace. So I think there's it's a supply demand component as well. There are also like post PhD or postdoc training programs. Like we've worked with one called Insight Data Science. There's one called the Data Incubator, where they put you through like it's like a short burst experience, but you learn how to do data science in a industry environment. You do like a project with a company. We've hired a lot of folks out of that, so they may have that on top of finishing their PhD. So those sorts of things can be good accelerators too.
Thank you.
And I think there's one more. Oh, Justin coming in with the tough questions. Yeah, so I think we really value in-person collaboration here at in J&J. So we believe pretty strongly in the hybrid model where we're in the office some days, and so in the U.S. we call it JJ Flex. So we spend 2 days remote and 3 days on site, and that's the kind of ebbs and flows with the COVID waves. And so like the last wave we went fully remote again, but in when the cases are low, or that is the expectation moving forward. A lot of companies are going though full having full remote roles, and I think we'll have to continue to wrestle with that, because I think there is a lot of great talent to tap into that certainly doesn't want to live in rural New Jersey where we are. We're not helping ourselves with the location, but I think remote is here to stay. I think we've all proven we can get a lot of jobs done fully remotely. It would be tough for me to do the role I'm in now fully remote. I think influencing other leaders at my level, when you can look somebody in the eye in the room, it makes such a difference compared to what you can do on Zoom. But if you're writing code all day, and I even I tell my team members this, if you're if this Tuesday that's what you're going to do, if that's what is required, just stay home. You don't need to to come sit in a room by yourself here. It's not worth the commute, but really try to make the most of those days that you are here for innovative ideas, whiteboarding sessions, and those sort of ad hoc conversations that you have at lunch or in the coffee shop, or those sorts of things. So I think it's going to be a balance.
Well, with that, I will go ahead and conclude our meeting. I want to thank Jackie first, Dr. Jackie Vahey, and thank you for moderating. And once again, congratulations. And Jeff, thank you so much for joining us and spending your time with us today and sharing so much insight about your journey from all the way from Duke till now. We really appreciate it. But thanks everyone for showing up tonight. I hope you have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. Thank you all. Have a great night, and go Duke.